The heat that summer could split the earth wide open, and by the time I saw her, she'd been walking through it for miles. She was barefoot, skin-baked red dress clinging with sweat, and in her arms she carried a baby who looked too weak to cry. Every step seemed to cost her more than she had left, but she kept moving toward my porch, toward the one scrap of shade for miles. I didn't know her name, then didn't know why she was out in that killing sun with no shoes and no water, but I knew if she stopped, neither of them would see nightfall. I stayed where I was, watching her cross that last stretch of yard, wondering if she'd make it or fall before she reached the steps. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever been faced with a moment you knew would change your life if you stepped forward. I've been out here on my own for 6 years, working a patch of land east of the Verde. Folks in town call it the edge of nowhere, but it's been mine since I signed the claim after the war. My brothers never made it back from Tennessee, and I didn't see the sense in going home to an empty house. So I headed west with a stiff leg and just enough to buy seed and tools. I learned to work with what I had, water drawn from the well. Before the sun was high, fences mended with whatever timber I could salvage, chickens fed before I took my own breakfast. Sundays were for resting the horses, checking the roof line, and letting the wind clear the week's dust from the yard. My folks taught me early that you look after what's yours, livestock, neighbors, even strangers if they're in real need. But you don't take on more than you can carry. Life out here makes you weigh every choice against what it'll cost come winter. The cattle buyers and land speculators in Cotton Ridge, they've got money to waste. My world's been leaner, a ledger that's balanced in chores done and fences standing, not in dollars. Maybe that's why I've kept to myself. Solitude's easier than trusting someone who might just walk away. Still, there are some things you don't turn your back on. I'd seen riders come through who thought the open country was theirs for the taking. Some looking for work, others looking for trouble. You learn quick to judge which is which before they reach your gate. That day, the woman in the yard wasn't trouble, but she was carrying it on her shoulders. You could see it in the way she shifted the baby in her arms, in the set of her jaw that said she'd already walked farther than anyone should in that heat. She was close enough now that I could see her lips were cracked, her eyes narrowed against the glare. I didn't know where she'd come from, but I had a notion what might have sent her. Folks get cast out for less than speaking their mind, and it's a long walk to anywhere from out here. The question was whether I'd let her cross onto my porch, or turn her back toward the same horizon she'd been fighting all day. I stayed on the porch a while, watching her close the distance. Each step pressed a fresh print into the baked dirt, and I could see the way her knees wavered under the weight she carried. She never once looked away from the shade at my door, as if that was the only thing keeping her moving. When she reached the gate, she stopped, shifted the child in her arms, and gripped the top rail for balance. I turned, went inside, and came back with a tin cup of water, a folded blanket, half a loaf of bread, and a damp cloth. I set them on the bottom step, then sat down in my chair by the door, hands on my knees. She pushed the gate open and came up the path, her bare feet sinking into the loose dirt. She sat on the porch boards and took the cup. Her hands shook, but she drank just enough to wet her lips before holding it to the baby. The child stirred faintly, eyes half closed. She broke off a corner of the bread and ate it slow, pausing to wipe the little one's face with the damp cloth. When she leaned back against the post, the blanket pulled around them both. I saw the way her arms locked around the child, as if she feared someone might take her. I stayed quiet. Night settled in the air, finally cooling. Somewhere behind the barn, the chickens rustled down into their roost. I went inside and closed the door. She stayed on the porch, through the dark, not asleep so much as resting with her eyes closed. At first light, I was hauling water from the well to the horse trough. My leg was stiff from the change in temperature, but the rhythm of the work kept it steady. I glanced toward the porch now and then, She was still there, the blanket around her shoulders, watching me work. When I came back up from the pasture, I set a bowl of hot porridge near her, steam curling in the cool air, and a half-pint jar of fresh well water sealed under a scrap of cloth. "For the baby," I said. She gave a small nod. After a moment, she told me her name was Naomi. I dropped a folded feed sack blanket at her feet before heading back to the yard. The smell of cinnamon rose from the bowl as she fed the baby, by dipping a finger first, letting the child taste before spooning more in. Color came back to the baby's cheeks by degrees, and the sound of her drinking filled the quiet between us. When the sun climbed higher, I fixed a broken rail on the corral. The steady knock of the hammer was the only noise for a long time. She watched from the porch until I told her the storeroom would be cooler. She stepped inside carrying the baby and found the mattress on its crate frame with a clean quilt folded at the foot. A tin basin with fresh water stood beside it. "Best I can do," I said. She nodded once. While the child slept, she washed her face, the water leaving dark streaks in the basin. By noon, I'd noticed the child's forehead was too warm. I brought a small tin of crushed willow bark and a clean square of cotton. "Fever," I told her. "Mix it with water and dab her skin." She asked if I wanted her to leave once the baby was better. I said she could stay a while, same as me, if she minded the gates and kept the hens off the porch. That afternoon, she carried the baby on her back and gathered eggs without being asked, moving careful but steady. When a cow bawled from the far end of the pasture, she looked toward the saddle shed and asked if I needed help. We spent an hour doctoring a stone bruise in the hoof, working side by side without trouble. That evening, I told her the baby ought to have a name. She looked down at the small face and spoke a word I didn't know. Later, after checking the rifle above my bed, as I always did, I lay awake longer than usual. I thought about how she had kept walking when most would have stopped, and how she had said little since she'd arrived, same as me. By the third day, the fever had broken. The baby's breathing was easier, her eyes brighter. Naomi stood on the porch with her bundled close, watching me drive nails into a section of fence. She stepped down into the yard and held the rails steady while I worked. We didn't speak. The silence between us was no longer heavy, just there. I hadn't asked about her people, and she hadn't asked about the war or why I was alone. That night after supper, she asked if my wife had died. I told her I'd never had one, then asked if she'd been married. "I was," she said. "He died." We left it at that. In the storeroom, she'd begun keeping small things, a basket woven from creek straw, 2 jars of grain. She'd said she would leave once the baby was strong, but she hadn't asked me for the road west or started packing. The next morning, she came out to where I was oiling the wagon yoke and asked if she could help. We worked in step, no fumbling. And when we were done, I asked if she planned on staying through the week. "I don't know," she said. "Plenty of work if you do," I told her. That night, after I'd nailed something to the gate post, she came out and saw it. My name carved there already now, with hers below it in fresh letters. She stood a long time with one hand on the baby's back, the other tracing the rough edge. The following day, a dry wind came in from the south. She moved in the kitchen as if she'd always known where everything belonged, the baby sitting alert in a basket near the table. She told me the child's name in English for the first time, Alma. It meant a clear path. I didn't ask more, but I tried the name aloud, and it fit. We ate together still without much talk. After breakfast, she followed the chickens into the side yard, checking under boards for snakes, moving like she'd done it before. Later, as she sewed a wrap from an old feed sack, I asked if she ever planned to go back. "There's nothing to go back to," she said. I told her my family was gone, my brothers lost in the war, my parents before that. She said her mother died giving birth to her youngest brother, and her father was the one who told her to leave. I told her he'd been wrong. She didn't answer, but her hands slowed on the sewing. That night she came out to the porch where I was sitting under the lantern. She said she'd been told she couldn't have children and that her daughter's birth was blamed for her husband's death. She told me she would have kept walking until she fell. When I asked why she'd stopped here, she said it was because I hadn't spoken. I'd just left water and bread. Before going in, she stepped toward me and kissed me once, steady and sure, then closed the door behind her. It was the first night in 6 years I didn't feel alone. The morning after she kissed me, the sun came in low through the east window, cutting a thin line of gold across the kitchen table. I set out 2 cups instead of 1 without thinking, then filled them both from the pot. Naomi came in with Alma tucked against her shoulder, her shawl pulled close against the early chill. She didn't glance away when our eyes met, and that was answer enough. Alma gnawed on a piece of bread softened in warm milk while we drank in quiet. It was the same silence we'd had before, but it felt different now, settled. After chores, I brought my rifle in from the rack and laid it across my lap at the table. The smell of gun oil mixed with the wood smoke from the stove. Naomi watched from the hearth while Alma dozed in her basket. Still expecting trouble, she asked. "Best to be ready," I said, working the cloth down the barrel. "Sometimes riders pass through. Not often, but when they do, they don't always ask first." She nodded, folding her arms. "Your nearest neighbor?" "A day's ride," I told her. "We trade feed sometimes. That's all." She seemed to measure that before speaking again. "If they ask about me, they won't," I said. "And if they do, I'll handle it." By midday, she was sweeping the storeroom, pulling dust from under the crates, and washing the windows. I stood in the doorway. "You could move into the main room if you wanted. It's warmer there." She straightened, holding the broom. "That your way of asking?" "It's your house too," I said. That night, she moved her few things into the main room. Alma's basket went in the corner near the bed, so either of us could reach her if she stirred. We lay side by side without touching, but it was clear this wasn't charity. It was choice. 2 days later, I saw dust on the ridge near midday. 3 riders and a wagon came slow along the pasture fence, then stopped. I stepped onto the porch with my rifle in hand. Naomi saw me from the chicken coop, lifted Alma into her arms, and went inside without a word. The lead rider called out asking to camp. I told him no. He leaned forward in the saddle, said they were hauling freight and needed a place to rest. I stayed where I was, voice even. "Not here." His eyes narrowed, and one of the younger men looked toward the doorway where Naomi stood. That look stayed on her too long. I shifted my weight forward so the boards creaked under my boot. The lead man's grin faded. He spat in the dirt, turned his horse, and they rode on. That night, I cleaned the rifle again. Naomi boiled water while Alma chewed on a strip of cloth. "You think they'll be back?" she asked. "Hard to say." She watched my hands on the rifle stock. "You weren't scared?" I glanced up. I was. Didn't show. She moved to sit beside me. They looked at me like I didn't belong here. I said, "You do. Out there they won't see it. They don't have to. I do." She leaned her head lightly against my shoulder, and we stayed that way until the fire burned low. The following week, the sky turned heavy with rain. It came in steady through the night, soaking deep into the ground. By morning, the barnyard was soft underfoot, and the mesquite leaves had turned bright with the water. Naomi stood on the porch barefoot, Alma resting easy on her hip. I passed by and took her hand as I went to check the roofline. The storm held for 2 days, filling the rain barrels and running in silver lines off the eaves. Inside, the air smelled of damp wool and coffee. Alma had more color in her cheeks each morning. One afternoon, Naomi was at the hearth carving strips from an old shirt to twist into cord. She'd been finding a use for nearly everything in the house, from feed sacks to spare jars. I watched her work a moment before saying I could ride into Cotton Ridge next week. "Speak to the magistrate," Her hand stilled on the cloth. "What for wouldn't take much," I said. "A name on a paper. Make it official." She looked toward Alma's basket, then back to me. "What would it change? Not much in the day-to-day. But you wouldn't have to worry about questions if your name matched mine." She said she didn't care what people asked. "I do," I told her. She studied me a long moment, then sat down beside me. "Then take me to the magistrate." 2 days after the rain cleared, I rode into town early. Boots shined, collar tucked. By dusk, I was back carrying a folded sheet from the magistrate's office. Naomi opened it, read the lines, and folded it again, tucking it into the bottom drawer under Alma's spare linens. That night, Alma lay between us, kicking her feet, catching my finger in her small hand. Naomi watched her for a long while before meeting my eyes. We didn't speak, but there wasn't anything left to explain. The next morning, I found wagon tracks near the far property line, deep ruts from heavy wheels turning off the main road where no one traveled. I followed them a short way before heading back. Naomi stepped onto the porch when she saw me coming. "What is it?" she asked. "Company." "Maybe trouble," I said. She didn't press, but I saw her glance toward the barn and then toward Alma's basket inside the door. The air between us was steady, but we both knew we'd keep watch. By the second morning after I'd found those tracks, I saw movement at the far edge of the pasture. 4 men, 3 on horseback, and 1 on a wagon seat came slow toward the fence line. A tarp covered something stacked high in the wagon bed. I stepped outside the door, closing soft behind me, rifle in hand, but pointed down. Naomi stood just inside, Alma cradled close, her shawl drawn around both of them. The riders stopped 30 yards out. The lead man was heavy through the middle, his mustache slicked and curling at the ends. "Afternoon," he called. I didn't answer. He tried again. "Heard this place was empty." "It's not," I said. He shifted in the saddle. "Didn't look like much from the road. Thought we'd water our horses. Maybe camp a night or 2. I shook my head. "Not here." His grin slipped. "You own this whole ridge, you're not camping here." He looked back at the others, then said they'd lost a wheel the day before, hauling freight for a trader out of Winslow. He offered to pay. "No charge," I told him. "But not here." One of the younger riders let his eyes drift toward the doorway. They stayed there too long. I shifted my stance so the boards under my boot let out a sharp creak. The lead man's smirk faded, and he spit into the dirt. "Suit yourself," he said, and they turned slow, heading east, with the wagon groaning behind them. That night, I cleaned the rifle again, not from use, but to be sure. Naomi tended water at the hearth. Alma chewing on a strip of cloth. "Think they'll be back?" she asked. "Maybe, maybe not." She watched me a long moment. "You weren't afraid?" "I was," I said. "Didn't show it." She came and sat beside me. They looked at me like I didn't belong. I told her she did. "Out there they won't see it. They don't have to. I do." She rested her head against my shoulder. We stayed like that until the fire burned low. The days after passed without a sign of them. I kept to my rounds, checking fence lines before dark, looking over the pasture edges at first light. Naomi went on with her work, moving with the same quiet purpose she'd had since the first day. Alma was stronger now, reaching for anything she could get her hands on, tracking our steps around the room. Rain had left the soil dark and easy to work, so Naomi cleared the garden bed by hand. I added a row of stones to the path between the house and barn, without saying anything about it, though she noticed. One afternoon, while she was washing at the trough and Alma kicked her feet in the water, I came up with something I'd been carving from a scrap of pine, a nameplate for the cradle. I crouched and handed it to her. Figured it ought to be hers now. The letters were cut deep, Alma, with the date she'd first come to the ranch. Naomi turned it in her hands. "It's her home," I said. "Same as ours." She looked at me a moment longer before speaking. "I'm late," she said. "A few weeks." I asked if she thought she might be. She nodded. "I'm sure." We stood there, the sound of the trough water dripping into the dirt. I asked if she felt all right. "I do," she said. I told her we'd get ready. "I'll clear the spare room. Make another cradle." She smiled faintly. "We don't need much. Just you, this place, and the quiet." I took her hand. "Then that's what we'll keep." That evening, we walked the fence together. She carried Alma on her back, her small head turned toward the setting sun. We stopped at the far post, leaning on the rail while the sky turned red over the ridge. "You ever think about leaving?" I asked. "No one left to run to," she said. "Everything I needed was here." I nodded. "I used to think the war took everything. Now I think it gave me room to start over." She looked at Alma, then at her own belly. "We built something real, with nothing but our hands. And we'll raise them strong," I said. We didn't light a lantern that night. The fire gave enough light. Naomi sat cross-legged on the rug, Alma asleep beside her. I sat behind her, working the knots out of her shoulders, with hands worn from years of labor. Before we turned in, I laid my palm on her belly, then over her heart. "We'll be ready," I said. She took my hand in both of hers. "I already am." By morning, we'd started clearing the spare room. No talk of names or plans beyond what needed doing. She worked slow but steady, sorting through cloth and smoothing it into neat stacks. Outside the ridge was quiet, the sun bright on wet earth. I checked the far fence again before noon. Nothing moved on the horizon. Still, I kept watch. Some things are worth holding on to, and some things worth guarding. We had both now. By the first week of April, the air over the ridge had softened. The ground that had been hard and split now held water enough for sprouts to push through where Naomi had planted. I worked along the fence line, driving nails into posts that had loosened with the winter winds. Naomi was in the garden bed, sleeves rolled to her elbows, turning soil by hand. Alma sat in the shade of a folded blanket strung between two stakes, batting at the air with open hands. Inside the house, things had changed as much as the land outside. The shelves Naomi scrubbed in winter now held neat stacks of cloth and baskets. Alma's cradle stood close to the bed, the new nameplate I'd carved fixed firm at its foot. At night, we lay with the sound of her breathing steady in the dark. Naomi's hand sometimes rested across my chest without a word. One morning I found her at the trough, Alma on her hip, washing clothes in the clear water. I came up behind her with a small bag of seed. "Corn'll do well this year," I said. She nodded without looking up, wringing out a shirt. "I'll plant tomorrow." We worked side by side most days now, unspoken tasks passing between us with a glance or a tilt of the head. Midweek, I told her I'd need to ride into Cotton Ridge for supplies. "Could use your help picking a few things," I said. She paused with the washboard in her hands. "If I go, people will stare." "They will," I said plainly. "But no one will touch you while I'm there." She looked at me for a long second, then said, "We'll go." We left before dawn 2 days later, the wagon loaded with 2 feed sacks to trade and a list for the store. Naomi sat beside me, Alma wrapped against her chest, the blanket pulled high around the child's head. The trail west was quiet, a light wind stirring the sage. When we rolled into town, the boards of the main street were already warming in the sun. Men outside the barber shop stopped talking as we passed. A pair of women crossed to the other side, eyes flicking over Naomi before they looked away. At the general store, I tied off the team and helped Naomi down. She adjusted the blanket around Alma, squared her shoulders, and stepped inside with me. The owner, Mr. Dillard, greeted me in his usual even way, his eyes only pausing a moment on Naomi before moving to the list I handed him. She walked the aisles, choosing a spool of thread and a tin of baking powder. I saw a woman near the front stiffen and step aside as Naomi passed, but Naomi kept her eyes on the shelves. When we stepped back outside, 3 men were by the water trough. One wore a black vest over a faded shirt, his sleeves rolled high. He tipped his hat toward me. "She yours?" he asked. "She's with me," I said. He smirked. "Didn't ask that." I took 1 step forward, slow enough for the boards to creak under my boot. The smirk slipped and he looked me over. My hand was near my hip, but I didn't move further. After a moment, he shifted his stance. "Nothing meant by it," he muttered. We left without another word. The ride home was quiet until we were halfway back. Naomi kept her eyes on the horizon ahead. "No one's ever stood in front of me before," she said. I kept my hand steady on the reins. "You won't be alone again." She glanced down at Alma, then back to the road. That night, a warm breeze moved over the ridge. Naomi sat at the hearth with Alma in her lap, the child's head tucked under her chin. I was by the door checking the rifle before hanging it back in its place. "What you said before," I told her, "about people staring." "They will. Maybe always." She looked at me, her voice calm. "I still want to stay." I sat beside her, my hand on her back. "Then we'll keep it this way," I said. The next morning, the smell of coffee filled the room before sunrise. Naomi was already at the stove, Alma awake and reaching for the steam rising from the pot. I stepped outside with my cup, the land stretching quiet in every direction. It was the kind of stillness that could change without warning. Out beyond the pasture, a hawk circled its shadow, slipping over the fence rails. I finished my coffee, set the cup on the porch rail, and went to hitch the team for the day's work. By late spring, the pasture was running green, and the creek at the far edge of the property carried enough water to hear from the porch. I had finished checking the north fence and was stacking cut mesquite by the barn when I saw Naomi step out with Alma. She stood for a moment looking toward the ridge before walking to the garden bed. Alma rode on her back, her hands gripping Naomi's braid as she bent to pull weeds from between the rows of corn. I carried the last of the wood inside just as Naomi was laying Alma in her cradle for a nap. "Corn's coming up strong," she said. I nodded and set the bundle by the stove. The quiet in the house was the easy kind, the sort that came from knowing what needed doing without having to speak it. She began slicing bread, and I poured water from the pitcher into 2 cups. After we'd eaten, I told her I planned to ride to the west pasture after midday. "Fence post came loose there," I said. "Might need your hands." She agreed without hesitation, pulling on her boots while Alma slept. The work went quick with both of us, her holding rails straight, while I drove nails, the sound of the hammer echoing across the open ground. Back at the house, I found her at the wash tub, with Alma on a folded blanket nearby. She was humming something I didn't recognize, Alma's eyes following every move of her hands. I leaned against the doorframe a moment before speaking. "We'll need to start cutting hay in 2 weeks." Naomi glanced up and nodded. "I can help with the binding." We went about the rest of the afternoon in that quiet rhythm. Toward evening, a line of dust appeared to the south, low and moving slow. I stepped onto the porch, shading my eyes. One rider this time, not a group. The figure came on steady until I could make out the outline of a rifle in the saddle scabbard and a wide-brim hat pulled low. Naomi had stepped out behind me by then, Alma against her hip. The rider stopped at the gate and dismounted. He was lean with a weathered face and a faint limp in his left leg. "Name's Caleb Vance," he said. "Wheel came off my wagon 5 miles back. Got a wife waiting in Winslow. I could use a team to haul it in." I looked at Naomi, then back at him. "Where's your wagon now?" "South Road, just past the dry arroyo." I told him to wait while I brought the team around. Naomi stayed on the porch, watching the man without speaking. When I came back, Caleb kept his hands where I could see them, his eyes steady. "Much obliged," he said. The trip to the wagon was quick, the wheel split clean along the hub. I helped him get it loaded, then pointed him toward the road west. He offered to pay in coin, but I waved it off. By the time I got back, the sun was low. Naomi was sitting on the steps with Alma, asleep in her arms. "He cause any trouble?" I asked. She shook her head. "Didn't say much. Watched the ridge while you were gone." I set the harness in the shed and joined her on the steps. The air had cooled, and the smell of mesquite smoke drifted in from somewhere east. After supper, I took the lantern outside to check the locks on the barn and gate. Naomi stood in the doorway, Alma propped against her shoulder. "Think there'll be more travelers?" she asked. "Hard to say. Roads stay clear most of summer, but the ridge draws some." I latched the gate and came back toward her. "If they do come, we're ready." We turned in not long after. Alma slept soundly, the soft rattle of her breathing filling the dark. Naomi's hand found mine under the blanket, her fingers closing around it. I held on, listening to the wind move over the ridge, knowing it could carry either calm or trouble with equal ease. The next morning broke clear, the kind of light that made every shadow sharp along the ridge. I just stepped out to the corral when I saw a lone rider cresting the southern rise. The sun caught on the metal of his rifle stock as he came down slow, keeping to the trail. Naomi stepped out onto the porch with Alma in her arms, her eyes narrowing as she followed my gaze. When the rider reached the gate, he swung down and tipped his hat. "Eli Turner?" he asked. His voice carried the weight of someone used to giving orders. He introduced himself as Deputy Marshal Frank Harlan, mid-40s, tall with a square jaw and the dust of many miles on his coat. "I'm looking for a woman and child Apache been missing from their people for some months," he said. "Reports place them near this stretch." Naomi shifted Alma against her shoulder, standing still but not hiding. I kept my tone even. "You found them. They're here under my protection." The deputy's eyes flicked between us. "Her family sent word," he said. "They want her returned?" Naomi's voice was quiet but steady. "They left me to die." The words hung in the air, and Harlan didn't answer right away. I asked him to step down from the gate and offered coffee. Inside, he removed his hat, his gaze sweeping the room without lingering. Over the mugs, he explained the tribe had lost people to sickness and hunger. Some believed Naomi's return might mend certain divides. She kept her eyes on the table, listening without speaking. "I'm not here to force you," Harlan said. "But I need to bring back an answer." I told him she'd speak for herself. Naomi rose, carried Alma to her cradle, and then turned back. "My life is here," she said. "My child's life is here. If they want to see us, they can come in peace." The deputy gave a slow nod. "I'll carry your words." He stayed the night in the small lean-to by the barn. The next morning, he thanked us and rode off south. For a week, the ridge stayed empty. Then, just before dusk one evening, we spotted dust again. 3 riders this time, moving in a tight line. I checked the rifle by the door while Naomi stepped inside with Alma. The lead rider was an older man, his hair in gray braids, wearing a long deerskin coat. 2 younger men followed. They halted at the gate, and the elder spoke first. "I am Chenoa's uncle," he said, using Naomi's Apache name. "We were told she lives." I said she was well, and if they wished to speak, they could do so here. Naomi came out slowly, Alma on her hip. The elder's face softened when he saw the child. They spoke in low tones. I couldn't follow the wind carrying fragments of words. After a while, he asked if they could camp nearby for the night. I agreed, pointing them toward the stand of cottonwoods by the creek. That evening, Naomi sat quiet at supper. "They came to see if I'd return," she said finally, "but not to take me by force." She didn't say more, and I didn't press her. Outside, the campfire by the creek glowed faint through the dark. At first light, I heard them breaking camp. The elder came to the porch, thanked me in careful English, and told Naomi she'd always have kin by the river should she seek them. She nodded, holding his gaze. Then they rode off toward the southern pass. The house felt still after they left. Naomi moved through the rooms with a certain ease, as though a knot had loosened inside her. That night, the wind off the ridge was gentle, carrying the sound of the creek, and for the first time in weeks, we slept without waking at every creak of the boards. The days after Naomi's kin rode south were quiet ones. The ridge was washed in the pale gold of autumn, and the air carried that faint bite that meant winter wasn't far off. Naomi moved through the house with a calmer step, and Alma's laughter came easier. The tension that had once shadowed our days seemed to lift, leaving room for something steadier to grow. I spent more time on the fence line, mending rails, before the cold set in. Naomi often joined me, Alma bundled in a sling across her chest. We worked side by side, the sound of the hammer and the lowing of cattle carrying across the pasture. Every so often she would glance toward the southern pass, not with fear, but with a kind of quiet watchfulness. One evening, as the sun slid behind the ridge, Naomi brought out a small bundle. She unwrapped it to reveal a strip of beadwork, its colors worn, but still bright. "This was my mother's," she said softly. "I want it to stay here." I took it carefully, feeling the weight of what it meant. It wasn't just a gift, it was a mark of belonging, an anchor she had chosen for herself. The weeks slipped by and winter settled in with its long nights and hard frosts. The stove stayed warm, the roof held against the wind, and the three of us settled into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like a life. Sometimes I'd catch Naomi humming to Alma in the glow of the lantern, her voice low and steady, and it struck me how far we'd come from the day I first found her. Looking back, I knew the land had tested us in every way, through hunger, through fear, through the pull of past ties. But we'd met those trials with the only tools we had: a bit of grit, a willingness to listen, and the choice to stand together when it would have been easier to turn away. Out here, justice isn't always a matter for the courts or the badge. Sometimes it's the quiet work of giving someone a place where they can stand on their own feet. Naomi had chosen her place, and I had chosen to make sure it held. If this tale has settled with you, take a moment to think on the folks you've let into your own life and the ways they've shaped your path. Out here on the frontier and anywhere else that might just be the truest kind of justice.